All right, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our fall final 2021 BUSSW E&I Speaker Series event, today co-sponsored with our macro department. The talk for tonight is Asian American Organizing, Lessons in Solidarity and Community Building with Carolyn Chou. My name is Dan Doe. I'm a doctoral candidate and president of our Alumni Association, and also a member of our BUSSW E&I committee, which includes all of our stakeholders from faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. The committee has been around for many years, engaging in the work of building equity and inclusion and justice here at BUSSW, as well as amplifying social justice focused activities here in the community. Some of the work we have engaged in includes organizing social justice learning communities, creating social justice focused case consultations, and really partnering with different departments around social justice focused interventions, student support, and solidarity circles, in addition to field department social justice seminars. We also have a wonderful resource page, so check that out. That's available to anyone. That includes podcasts, peer-reviewed lit, media articles, so definitely check that out. And we also just completed a 3-hour online module on structural and institutional racism. You can access many of these resources at our equity and inclusion page, right from bu.edu/SSW. I'm going to briefly review our format for today, then I'll introduce Carolyn, and she'll present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have our reflectors offer about a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Carolyn a question. Finally, we'll open it up to you all for some questions through the chat. A few Zoom housekeeping items before we get started. Anyone who's receiving CEUs here in the state of Massachusetts will need to keep your camera on during the entire session. If you're not receiving CEUs, go ahead and turn your camera off. You're all good during the talk, but turn it back on during Q&A. We would love to see you. If you are receiving CEUs, again, you'll need to complete the evaluation form. We'll have the link for you at the end of the session, and we'll put it in the chat. We also suggest having your Zoom settings set on speaker's view. The meeting is also being recorded, so please, if you aren't comfortable being recorded and you aren't receiving CEUs, please go ahead and keep your camera off during the entire event. We'll also be posting the recording here on our E&I website just a few days after the talk. So everyone's going to be muted. That's great. And please don't use the chat during Carolyn's presentation, as that can be a little distracting, but we'll open it up at the end for questions. Closed captioning is also available. To use closed caption, all you need to do is click on the closed caption button, usually at the bottom of your screen, and choose show subtitle for the captions to overlay. Finally, it goes without saying that all comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful of our entire BU-SSW community. We would also like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement reminds us all that colonialization is an enduring reality and that Boston University sits on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. If you're outside of Boston, take some time to learn about the tribal lands, where you live, and the ongoing movements to have land honored, acknowledged, and most importantly, to be returned. This past year has been a year like no other, with COVID-19 unmasking the devastating long-term effects of structural racism, anti-Asian violence, neoliberalism, and gender inequality. The timing of Carolyn's presentation couldn't be more appropriate for our historical moment, where we as social workers, part of our rural community, we stand at a crossroad. Our speaker tonight, Carolyn Chou, is the executive director of the Asian American Resource Workshop, where she supports the leadership development and organizing around issues of racial, economic, and social justice of a diverse base of progressive Asian Americans, primarily young adults. Through her work at AARW, Carolyn has supported building the leadership capacity and organizing of Vietnamese American young adults in Dorchester, really the heart of the Vietnamese community here in Boston. Alongside the young adult organizers, Carolyn has helped build the Dorchester Not For Sale formation in the neighborhood, which brings together a diverse set of neighborhood residents to fight for good jobs, truly affordable housing, and equitable planning. The Asian American umbrella includes a wide range of class experiences, languages, racialization, and gendered experiences. Building Pan-Asian progressive organizing includes building solidarity across our community and building the leadership of those often marginalized and invisibilized within the Asian American narrative, including queer and trans folks, South Asian communities, Southeast Asian communities, among others. This presentation will explore the opportunities and challenges in organizing and how organizing and healing justice connect, and lessons in building solidarity. So please join me in welcoming Carolyn Chou.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Dan. And I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. Yeah, again, it's really a pleasure to be with y'all tonight and to be talking about this and to be in dialogue together. So yeah, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the Asian American Resource Workshop where I work, which has been my political home for the last 10 years. And then kind of take us through some of the way and the complexities of the Asian American community and some of the nuances in Asian American experiences, and then talk about how we think about solidarity within the Asian American community, so across ethnic groups, as well as then with other communities of color and oppressed communities, and then talk about some examples of our organizing and as Dan spoke about in the introduction, this moment, right, and the rise of anti-Asian violence and what we can learn from responses to that. So to start, just to share about the Asian American Resource Workshop where I work, and which is a local grassroots organization. We say our mission is we're a political home for Pan-Asian communities in Greater Boston. We're a member-led organization committed to building grassroots power through political education, creative expression, and issue-based neighborhood organizing. And I wanted to start with our core values because I think it is reflective of, I think how we think about the work and the organizing. So we say our core values are nourishment, imagination, commitment, and adaptation. And, I think those speak for themselves, but just to say, right, we really think about how do we get to show up as our whole selves in the work? How do we imagine a new world and build power to make it true? How do we commit to the long haul and to each other in that? And how are we willing to be nimble and meet the moment, right? I think a lot of the last 2 years in this pandemic has probably taught all of us that our work has to meet the moment and meet people where they're at. And so the last thing about ARW before I get into kind of the presentation or more of the content is we think about our work. So as we were kind of thinking about going through some strategic thinking and trying to figure out like, what is the way we bring these different experiences of the Asian American community together, we really came to this anti-displacement framework. So thinking about displacement not just as housing, which is obviously a core of our work and a core of the work that's close to my heart, but how do we think about all the ways that folks are removed from our communities and not able to be part of building the thriving working class, immigrant, people of color, queer and trans communities that we are all, I hope, striving to build. And so for us, that means housing justice. It means immigrant rights and deportation defense. It means criminalization, surveillance, and abolition. It means environmental justice, because we see all of those as ways that folks are removed from our communities. And obviously with the underlying, or maybe not obviously, but there's a historical underlying piece, right, around colonization, around forced migration, around displacement more broadly outside of our neighborhoods and our city. But here in this moment, how do we think about all the ways folks are not able to stay and build the thriving communities we hope to build? So that's kind of what ARW is about and some of the work I've been helping build for the last period. But it really comes back to, right, what is Asian America? I think that there's a dominant narrative of what Asian means, right, in the US. So it means often East Asian folks, lighter skinned people, people with class or education privilege, people who've pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. It also means immigrants, right? Folks who are always othered and not from here. But actually, Asian America is extremely diverse, right? Including folks of a variety of class experiences, of how they're racialized, right? We know that South Asian community members, Southeast Asian community members, East Asian folks are all racialized very differently within our system, and different experiences of gender, of work, of all of these issues. But the label can often invisibilize that, right, and erase a lot of that nuance. But what does it mean then to keep doing work as Asian Americans together? I think that's like a big existential question that hopefully some of my examples help us think about. This is not moving. Oh, there we go. And so, just as I was just speaking about, right, Asian American communities, across all of that difference, right, are seen in these two competing ways at the same time. So both as a model minority, right? So as, this constructed myth of Asians as the good immigrants, as the good people of color, as the people who have done things the right way, which was really, right, a tool of the white supremacist system to pit our communities against other communities of color, particularly Black communities, and other marginalized people. So that's one way in which we're seen within the system. And then the other way, which I think has been highlighted in this moment where we're talking about anti-Asian violence, is as perpetual foreigners, right? So always other, always not from here, always outside of what the US is. And so, we see that pet and threat being played out all the time, and both of those, right, getting played when it is convenient and when it is useful to perpetuate the system. But here is like the truth of who Asian Americans here in Greater Boston are, right? So these are all stats from Boston Indicators, and the document will be in the links on the website. But these are, we're going to go through a few of these. So, you can see here, but Asian poverty is 2 times white poverty in Greater Boston and 3 times white poverty in Boston. So, just to highlight, right, this is, I think for me, this is always the place, that's important to start to say all of this racialized tropes that we live in, right? This is the reality of here in our city, kind of the demographics of the Asian American community. And then when you break it down, right, as we were talking about ethnic difference, the different ethnic communities, you see different experiences, right? And so Asian poverty varies greatly by nationality. And these are just some of these are just some examples. There's obviously a larger data set. And income and education attainment vary greatly across APAC communities, right? So you see that Cambodian and Vietnamese folks, who we often refer to as Southeast Asian communities, particularly folks from Southeast Asia who were impacted and came here because of the US war in Southeast Asia. You see, right, household incomes being quite different than what we see in Japanese, Korean, and Indian communities. And just to say, right, we think about the model minority, we think about, high education attainment, highly educated career paths, right? But in communities like the Cambodian and Vietnamese community, right, folks are working as in manufacturing. Folks are working in nail salons, carpenters, right, stockers and order fillers, cashiers. And so this is the real experience every day of Asian American community members here in Massachusetts. And the last two I will show is just this to say, right, that the pandemic we know has revealed so much. And some of that is that Asian community members are more likely to be in hard-hit industries that have closed at high rates. And so you can see, right, in food service, in retail, in healthcare. And then the last just piece of data I wanted to show is that almost a quarter of undocumented immigrants here in Massachusetts are Asian American or from Asia. And, you know, I think this one for us has been something we've been thinking about in our organizing, but I also, you know, show, because I think it's not it kind of pushes against the dominant narrative, right, that we understand, but really reveals the nuance of issues like immigration and housing and economic justice. So that's, you know, that's just some like broad strokes, what is going on in our Asian American communities. But, you know, why do we still organize together, right? Why do we still try to build something that is across some of these differences? I think that, you know, it's a real question, right? And for me, I think a lot about how do we build Pan-Asian solidarity and multi-ethnic Asian American power and political community. And a core part of why and how we do that is by not making broad statements, but always being specific about who is disproportionately impacted, about who is most affected by whatever issue we're talking about. But how do we all have a stake in it? How do we all have skin in the game? And how do we build an Asian American community that doesn't say, you know, Asian when we mean Chinese or we mean Japanese or we mean Korean, but actually is specific about those experiences, but also is invested in each other and is invested in all of those experiences and building something that builds together, right? Because when we think about people power, it has to be about building something big and also building something where we all feel our stake in what's going on, but that also we don't shy away from those differences, right? That we really build from that place and we think about who is most impacted as a starting point to build a broad coalition. So, you know, toward that end, I wanted to share two examples of work we've done that I think gets at that question around Pan-Asian political power and solidarity. And so the first one is our deportation defense work. So as I talked about earlier in the data slide, in the Asian American community, there are particular challenges and experiences that Southeast Asian community members face. And in this, when I say Southeast Asian, I mean folks from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and ethnic groups like Hmong folks who are from that region, who are all impacted by the US war in Southeast Asia, which we often call the Vietnam War. And, you know, these communities are not large within the, you know, broad, the numbers of Asians in the US, but there's a particular experience of displacement that is rooted in US imperialism, that is rooted in US involvement in folks' homelands, right? And brought them to neighborhoods like Fields Corner, to places like Lowell and Lynn. And so, you know, 5 years ago, we started at AirW exploring what would it look like for us to take on work of building power with and supporting Southeast Asian community members facing deportation. And the folks we are working with are facing deportation because of criminal convictions. So they came here as refugees from the war, mostly as children, maybe were born in the refugee camps, maybe never stepped foot on the countries from which they have their passports, and came here, were resettled into Black and brown neighborhoods that had been disinvested in by you know, our system, and got caught up in the same systems that criminalized Black and brown community members in the 80s and 90s. And now, because of their criminal convictions, are facing deportation to countries that they may have never known. If they did know, left because of U.S. involvement, right? And now are potentially having to return and leave their families that they've built here in the U.S. And so, you know, for us, this work, it was not easy to start, right? It is not. It is the opposite of doing model minority, of the model minority myth, right? It's the opposite of everything that dominant culture tells us about our Asian communities. And that was like at its core why we felt like this is work we have to do to build Pan-Asian solidarity, to center folks who are most impacted, whose stories have been totally left out of the dominant narrative of Asian America, and to challenge respectability politics, and to challenge who is deserving within our society, right? And who is deserving of dignity and to be able to stay in their homes with their families. And so for the past 5 years, we've been building with Vietnamese and Cambodian community members to fight deportation cases and to keep folks here, and work with cities and the state and some federal policy around what does it look like to stop Southeast Asian deportation. And our biggest victory is right before the pandemic shut everything down. The first Cambodian community member was able to return to the East Coast from Cambodia and return to his family. And so, you know, we continue to build out this work, both those policy pieces, the individual casework, which we do in partnership with Greater Boston Legal Services, and the storytelling and narrative change. Because for us, that's a core part of how we broaden and build that solidarity of what is Asian America, right? And how do we build a new narrative of who our people are. And so, yeah, there's lots more to say on the deportation work, and I'm happy to provide more resources later. But just, you know, as an example, and how do, you know, we, like, I'm a Chinese American woman, how do we as folks who might not be Southeast Asian, might not, or even are, but aren't impacted, right? How do we relate this to our own family's experiences, right, of migration, of challenge, hardship in this country, without and create that solidarity without, you know, saying it's all the same, right? Because we know it's not all the same, but we know that there's a place from which we can all have a stake in changing the system together, right? And so that's kind of, you know, I think an example of solidarity within the Asian community, and how are we building that solidarity across the Asian diaspora. And then, you know, the second piece is how are we building solidarity with other marginalized people, right? Because we know we have to address things like anti-Blackness in our own community, but the way to do that is both by having the conversations, but it's really by working side by side, right? And fighting together for what we know our communities need. And so, as it kind of said in my bio, you know, through our work at the Asian American Resource Workshop and being in Fields Corner, which is the heart of the Vietnamese community, but it's also a multiracial neighborhood, working class neighborhood in Boston, we started to come together with other residents to talk about the development we were seeing across our neighborhood, to talk about the gentrification, right? To talk about what we were seeing and folks getting evicted every day. And what would it look like to build something together where we were all, where our different needs were being lifted up, but we understood that we all need each other to fight for what all of our neighbors deserve, right? Which is to stay in our community, in the neighborhood that folks have lived in, have built, right? Have built their lives in. And so, you know, for the Vietnamese community, the Asian community in the neighborhood, a lot of the initial pieces were around language access at meetings, right? we were going to meetings about developments, about luxury condos coming to our neighborhood, and you could only participate if you speak English. So what does it mean? So, you know, we're just saying people just need to be even able to have a voice, let alone let's talk about what's happening here, right? And that is not, you know, for Black folks or working class white folks in the neighborhood, that is not necessarily the primary concern, right? But for Vietnamese folks, for Cape Verdean immigrants, for Latinx immigrants, it was. So that was one piece, right? And how do we all, then that became a demand that we were all fighting for, not just folks who worked in the Vietnamese community, but all together saying this is part of what we need to have a real community process. And it means that Black folks need to be able to stay in our neighborhood. The Vietnamese community that gets all of its services here in language needs to be able to stay. The Cape Verdean folks who are here and have small businesses all up and down our area need to be able to stay. And that these are not separate, right? But they're part of one platform and part of one vision of what a multiracial working class neighborhood means. And, you know, so we started fighting back against luxury developers coming to our neighborhood, including Asian developers, including a billionaire from Hong Kong who is building down the street in our neighborhood. And for us, it was saying, you know, we are here to build multiracial working class power that keeps the people who are most at the margins here in our neighborhood, right? Including our unhoused neighbors, including, like every block. And we're gonna say that every developer has to answer to what they're gonna do to keep folks here. You can't build condos for people who make $100,000 when, you know, you see the Vietnamese community numbers. We know in other communities of color that folks are making like $30,000 a year, right? That you have to be able to answer that question. And we've lost a lot in our work, but I think what we have gained is a real, we are real players, right? The old school white Boston thing is live and well here in Dorchester, but you know, we've been able to say, this is our neighborhood. This is a multiracial neighborhood. This is all of our neighborhood, and we're gonna fight together for that. And we've also, we have won some material gains for folks, right? Because for us, it's about both shifting the narrative and the conversation, but also winning things day to day for people, right? Because we know that folks are in crisis every day, and we have to be able to do both. And so, you know, that's sort of the work, right, we had been doing that kind of has been building this idea of solidarity both within the Asian community and beyond, and with other marginalized groups. And then, you know, right, this last year, we started really being in more conversations around anti-Asian violence and the rise of anti-Asian violence. And you know, I think really culminating in what happened in Atlanta, which we, you know, really understood to be at the intersection of race, class, and gender. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we could support an intervention that is not based in the carceral system. Because of all the immigration work we've been doing, because of what I was just sharing with you, we knew that not only was it pitting our communities against Black folks and other marginalized communities, it was also negatively impacting our own people, right? That not all Asian folks, but some Southeast Asian folks have been impacted by the criminal legal system, and that we were not willing to stand for a system that continued to criminalize both Cambodian and Vietnamese folks in our own communities and other people of color, particularly Black folks, right? So so for us, it's really about highlighting how does this moment show us what the root causes of violence are, right? So how do we how do we go back to our anti-displacement framework and say that we need to stabilize our communities, we need to stabilize other communities of color, and that's going to be how we all feel safe. I think it also, though, really demonstrated the need for real robust healing and mental health support within our Asian communities and across the board, right? That there is such a deep lack of culturally competent and linguistically specific mental health services. And it's really exacerbated the fear and the isolation, right, of the pandemic and of this moment of anti-Asian violence, which always goes back to this conversation about how, you know, folks are racialized, right? But we knew that we had to talk about these root causes and the deeper issues, and that we know that more criminalization and more policing does not keep us safer. It actually creates more trauma for everyone. And we also knew some of that because for our South Asian community members, you know, since 9/11, folks have been dealing with this version of the perpetual foreigner, right? That is around Islamophobia, and we saw what happened, right? We saw how the FBI has now, you know, targeted Muslim organizers and targeted Muslim and South Asian communities out of, you know, an attempt to keep everyone safe. And so we knew that our folks could not be pitted against each other, and we know that what we really need is to create a narrative and conditions where we're talking about stability and where we're talking about support and where we're talking about healing. And so that's, you know, been a big piece. And how do we make sure gender and class are not erased from the conversation, right? Because we can't talk about what happened in Atlanta without talking about sex workers, without talking about low-wage workers, and without talking about the role of women in our communities. And so, you know, I think that it has allowed us to bring those conversations to the forefront, but it's been really challenging. And I know there are folks on this call even that have been working with us to think about what are alternatives to policing for mental health crisis, for other kinds of crisis, and how do we really take care of each other as a community. And I think that the pandemic and all the mutual aid work many of us have done gives us some models to start with, but how do we really commit to that work and use this moment to double down on our commitment to this work. So I will end by just kind of saying that I think from those different examples, as I was reflecting, I felt like there were three key themes that I wanted to lift up, or key lessons that I hope can be helpful in work you all are doing moving forward. One is that relationship building has to be the foundation of all of our organizing work, right? And that takes time. Like, we've been able to move into this conversation around anti-Asian violence and have some clear pieces of work we want to move and understand the frame because we've been building, right? We've been building with those marginalized within our own community, and we've been building multiracial solidarity and multiracial power within our neighborhood and within the city. So that's one key thing. The second one is that, though, it's about relationships, but ultimately it's about building power, right? And it's about building people power and grassroots power to make the changes that our folks need every day to impact their everyday lives. And that, yeah, we have to do this narrative shift and this relationship building as part of building broader multiracial working class power. And then the third, and last piece is just, you know, I think through all of this work, I've really learned that so much of our work has been about bringing the margins to the center, about saying that we won't leave folks behind, that we will lift up those experiences that are so often left out, and we will use those to influence how we build relationships, how we think about policy, how we think about organizing campaigns, and what kind of power we're trying to build, right? Because when we take away all the noise, but we thought about, okay, how do we respond to keeping our folks safe right now, and what is not the right response? We knew that more policing was not the right response, not just from a theoretical place, but because we talked to Southeast Asian community members who've been in prison, right? And we knew what their experiences were, even though within the dominant narrative, their stories are totally erased, right? But we knew from that, it was grounded in that lived experience, as well as, a broader framework that we were able to understand how we wanted to move through that period. And so those are just three pieces I think about when I think about both our work building Asian American political community, and more broadly when we think about how we build coalition and how we build work that brings all of our people along and builds a better world for all of us. So I think I will end there, and just to put on the screen, that's my email, and I will be talking more, but I'm happy to be in more conversation with folks and continue to work with folks. So I will stop my screen sharing now.
Carolyn, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And at this time, I'll invite the audience to start thinking about some questions to chat to you as we move into our reflector section. I would first like to introduce our first reflector, Professor Hayu Chris Ham, who is a professor at BUSSW. Professor Ham is the first Asian American professor who was promoted to full professor at BUSSW. Her research has been funded by the National Institute of Health, NIH, the National Science Foundation. Through her groundbreaking research, she's really dedicated to reducing health disparities with a particular emphasis on building empirical evidence of health risk behaviors such as self-harm, suicide, and HIV risk behaviors among young adults. Professor Ham, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you so much, Carolyn. This is a really important topic, and I'm really thankful for Dawn to providing us this opportunity to have this community come together and to really think about this critical question. So I just wanted to kind of reflect on what you said, and I think you said really important thing, that right now we need support and healing for Asian American community. And in fact, we need support and healing for everybody, right? Regardless of our race, regardless of who we are all burned out, we are all hurt, we've been all stressed out and have so high anxiety and depression rates, and then we don't really have the solution. We don't, it seems like every day we are running into more and more problems. And someday, we feel like we are getting better. Finally, we see the light, in the tunnel. But then again, now we have another variant, coming up to us, and trying to really understand what's going on, and if there is any, light at the end of this tunnel. So we have a lot of uncertainties right now. So when we think about Asian Americans, yes, it's true that we all have gone through a lot of difficulties during this pandemic. However, when we think about Asian American population, these are the groups who have gone through particular pain and particular agony and fear of violence. So therefore, I think it is really important for us to really think about what that means and what we need to do. So when Carolyn talked about this, Asian American groups, when we think about this group, we are faced with particular challenges. The reason why is this. So Asian Americans, when you think about them, Asian Americans have a very strong ethnic identity. What that means is that I'm from Korea, so I consider myself as a Korean woman. I came to America at the age of 23 years old. So I'm a Korean. And it took me a long time to even recognize that I became a Korean American. Okay. And when I was growing up in Korea, I learned about all the histories of China, Vietnam, and Thailand, and all these kind of different countries in the world, right? Asian countries. But I spent so much time learning about the wars that we had against Japan, against China, against all these other countries. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that, I have learned to develop my own ethnic identity. Even though I came to America, it's hard to develop the racial identity as Asian Americans. Even though I'm educated, I'm in this area, that I do research in this area. So the reason why is that because we came from very different countries, and our location, our position of our home countries are very different in global setting. We have different languages, okay, and also we are located, we reside in different places. We have a very different foods, so we are actually divided, and we are segregated within Asian Americans. So my question is this: how can we increase our awareness of the importance of working together? Because in order for us to survive and at the end of the day to thrive, we must work together. We must understand. We must spend our time together. We must learn how to understand and like each other, despite of what we have learned and despite of all these painful histories that we have gone through. How can we do that? What are the bottom-up approach? What are the top-to-bottom approach? So those are my questions. I know it's very complicated. However, maybe there's something that is worthwhile to think about. Think about the solution. It may take a long time, but I think this is something that I'm always curious about. So Carolyn, if you can share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that, the question and just your framing. I think that's right. And I mean, I didn't even touch on that. Yeah, Asian America is inherently fractured because, yeah, there are dynamics between our homelands, that there is colonization across our home countries, and that, those issues, we can't totally separate, right, our experience in the US from a global experience. But, I do think that, here we are, right? As you said, we're here in this cultural context in which we are racialized in a particular way and have some shared, though different, I think, as we laid out, there's some shared threads of how we experience race in the US. And so, I think that it's important for us to do that political education, to have accessible ways to talk about it, in language ways to talk about it. And I think there are shared things we can, things that feel basic but are like huge, that would support all of our immigrant communities. So language access, as you raised, right? We know in Asian communities, part of the challenge is there's so many languages, but we can still push for language access for our communities, and for data equity or disaggregated data for our communities. And that's ways to actually not just say we're all Asian, but to show those specific needs. But I think when we fight for them together, we're able to build that shared story of why we need those things, without erasing the specific needs that our different ethnic communities may have. And then, yeah, how do we commit to doing real political education, real popular education about the history of Asian communities in the US, right? Whether you are fourth generation or a recent immigrant, that we understand that we are in this context, and by learning the history of Asians in the US, I think we'll have a better understanding of what are the places where we're united in similar challenges and then similar potential solutions. So yeah, I think for me, it's really about not saying that, oh, we just need to say we're Asian and not talk about any of those differences, but where are the places we can come together and work and have our voices work for something together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ham, for that reflection and question. I'm going to introduce Desi Hartman, who is a first-year Masters of Social Work MSW student here at Boston University and works at the Vital Village Networks based out of the Boston Medical Center. Desi Hartman is a Filipina Asian American adoptee and proud first-generation student. She's passionate about providing trauma-informed, dignified mental health support to children and families of color that are impacted by hardships related to immigration, family separation, and racial injustices. Previously, Desi served as the advocacy lead with UNICEF USA New England, where she organized a diverse group of volunteers to advocate for children's rights and graduate from Colorado College with a degree in psychology and global health. Desi, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan and Caroline. Thank you so much for such an enriching and powerful talk. I feel like there's so many insights, reflections, and things I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. I guess one, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I have 2 questions, but I'll try to keep it short. Dan's like, no, 1 question. But I really resonate with the question you posed as far as like, what is Asian American, and like how that label can erase our differences sometimes and can be kind of harmful. And just like how you brought up, and even building on the last question of how can we like find ourselves within the diaspora, and especially I guess one of the questions I'd like to pose is like, there's a very large part of the diaspora that is adopted, like me, who are adopted into primarily white families in America, and we're still a part of the diaspora. And like how can the Asian American and Pacific Islander community like be more inclusive in thinking about our adoptee community as a part of the diaspora? And then super short question, but I think especially with your work around detention work and really working with immigrants, I think it really made me think about a time when I was volunteering with people who were detained in ICE detention, and how there was a man who was Chinese American and he could not speak English, and how his Latino peers like supported him during that time, and it was probably like the strongest act of solidarity that I saw. And so just curious about like just more examples of how, because I think oftentimes we don't know across races that we're up against the same things until we're like in that position, and like how can we how can we like be more unified in saying that we're up against the same things. So thank you for the extended time, and potential second question if you want to address that.
Yeah, well, I think I think there are ways they're connected for sure, the 2 questions. Yeah, thanks for raising the piece on adoptees. I think I've been thinking about it a lot with the immigration work and criminalization work. How adoptees, Asian adoptees, transracial, transnational adoptees are particularly impacted by some of these systems, right? So when we think about, undocumented Asian folks, I mean, there are kind of fairly, I guess, well known, at least within Asian American activist circles, stories of adoptees who are in the same situation as Southeast Asian folks facing deportation, because if their adoptive families didn't do their paperwork properly, and they got locked up like a U.S. born young person, and then their green card similarly gets voided, like what happens to Southeast Asian folks, right? Folks can be in the same situations, and it's often related to trauma and and family dynamics and I think racialization and all of that. So I think it's really important, right? And I think to ARW's work for us, it's been, so that's just one specific example. And then more broadly, I think it's really important that we continue to create an Asian American narrative that is not rooted, that holds all of our different family stories in their fullness, but is not rooted only in a certain experience of family or immigration, but is also says we don't have to have that to understand the ways in which we've been racialized by the system and impacted by the system, and how that has informed who we've become and how we see ourselves and see our work in the world, right? So it's not to say where there aren't points of overlap between certain things we shouldn't, in terms of family stories or, relationship to elders, that we shouldn't lift that up. But I think that it's important, and what having adoptees in our base challenges us to do is to say that is all important, and there are other ways to come into this racial identity formation and to show up in Asian American spaces, and that they're all valid, and that the ones that are furthest from the center have to move toward the center. And I think then to your second question, I just really agree and appreciate you lifting it up, right? That solidarity can't just be an intellectual act. It has to be something we see in practice and we lift up in practice. So, I think your example is similar to anything I would share, right? Just around, for us in the neighborhood, right? Folks walk down the same streets, folks go to the same stores, folks live in the same triple deckers. And so while there's lots of tension and lots of challenges that come up, that those shared experiences, there's so much to build on and so much potential for us to really see ourselves as in the struggle together.
Thanks, Ceci, for that question, Carolyn, for that response. Our final reflector today is Sami John, who is an alumna of our BUSSW doctoral program and currently a senior research associate at Advocates for Human Potentials Center for Research and Evaluation. Her prior work and expertise focuses on issues related with substance use disorders and mental health, including substance use treatment, access, and utilization, as well as health equity. Dr. John is also a licensed and certified social worker in Massachusetts, where she continues to work with individuals diagnosed with severe mental health and substance use disorders in inpatient settings. In her current position at AHP, she leads local program evaluations, data management, and data analysis on several healthcare and social services projects. Sami, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was a great presentation, and really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot, and I really have to commend the amount of work that you've done. I really appreciated, I guess, just trying to get Asian American communities together rather than having it so segmented. I agree that, it's very rare that I see that. Every time I see these organized groups who, for any reason, for, any sort of social, awareness or anything like that, it's never like Asian American communities we're less so. I think it's always Korean American, Chinese American, it's always very segmented. And I feel like that's been a big struggle in general, even among younger people. So I really appreciated that you kind of leaned into that difficulty. And so the other piece that really struck out to me was just your highlighting and kind of fighting against the typical narrative of Asian Americans, like you said. And I am tired of hearing like, oh, Asians are like model minorities and they're all doing extremely well. And so I do appreciate, I think you're highlighting that that's not always the experience. Oftentimes it's really never the experience for certain groups. And so, myself as a Korean American person, the typical narrative was never something that applied to me. So I have to say that it's really refreshing to hear something different. And so I think my question really is, about more, so we heard about issues of deportation and how you're battling, and sort of working around that, and the economic differences that are much different from what maybe some people might immediately associate with the Asian American group. But also you mentioned mental health, and I was really kind of curious about your approach, or what you were hoping to be the approach for helping young adult and also, more maybe elderly Asian American groups tackle mental health. And the reason that I was curious about this is because there are just so many, it's not just, seeing a therapist, right? For this group, it's languages, like you said. If you're economically struggling, you have insurance to worry about. How are you going to pay for it? Oftentimes, some people don't have insurance. Therapy is expensive, or these types of services are extremely expensive. How are you even going to get there, if you don't have transport options? Maybe that's less the case in Boston, but even then, so there are all these like barriers that I feel like become a larger issue. And even on top of that, I always hear too that sometimes like a Korean American person might not be willing to see somebody who speaks Korean, who generally is Korean, because it hits a little too close to home. So that might be the other piece too, is it almost works against a lot of people. So all of that said, I guess I'm kind of curious what, if that's something that has come up for you, if you thought about your approach, and yeah, just sort of any experience you've had with that, with just mental health and just openly even talking about it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. One thing is just, I do feel like all this conversation around anti-Asian violence and just the pandemic conditions we're all surviving in have really gotten the Asian serving organizations at least in Boston and Massachusetts, to think more about how do we support funding for and pathways to culturally competent and linguistically adequate mental health services. And so we've actually, I'll talk a little bit about how I think about the organizing, but more broadly, and if anyone is interested in talking more about that, we are definitely want to be supportive of the field and what folks need, because I think it's about how is it culturally competent and or, in the right language. And what you said, we hear the flip, which is like people don't want to go to their local health center where they know literally everyone to get services, right? Sometimes because, yeah, it doesn't feel anonymous and it feels like, we live in kind of small insular communities. So I think that is a piece of work that's probably underdeveloped for what I understand, and it's something I think that there's a lot of potential to build with social workers, with other mental health providers, and with Asian American organizations. But at ARW, in our work and in our organizing, I think we really do see the organizing as part of people's healing and as part of people's mental health journey, right? That by, that one thing we can say across all Asian communities that I feel confident to say is shared is that the sense of invisibility, right? This sense of not being seen, whatever our extremely different experiences might be. And I think that there's something about like organizing together and being seen together that that can be really that is so generative for for folks, right? And can really support people on their healing journeys. So, you know, I think for me, that's a big part, and that's why we do the work we're doing, right? And like, you know, when someone has a eviction case or a deportation order and like 20 people they don't know show up to ICE check-in, show up to their house before their eviction court date, like that feeling of community and support, I think is huge, right? For people's sense of collective healing and personal healing. So just to say, I think that is a big piece we can't ignore. And there's so many gaps in the more traditional mental health system that we need to fill for folks. And yeah, I think I have one other thing, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sammy, and thank you, Carolyn, for that response. Folks out here in the ethos, feel free to type in your chat questions. We do have a reflection from a participant about the importance of uniting Asian Americans as resonating with their experience with the disability community and the need to do the same. They're fractured under the same labels when people really just want the same thing. And so, yeah, please continue to put your questions in the chat. And Carolyn, I know I don't really get to reflect, but I'm gonna offer while I'm waiting for a chat is just that what you talked about of organizing around mental health is if we address some of the structural and systemic deportation, racism, economic inequality, we really reduce a lot of the mental health impacts and the symptoms of these conditions. And also lifting up what you talked about earlier of that invisibility. So like the LGBTQ Asian American folks who are often left out of those conversations. Now, quick question is, lots of them coming in the chat, I gotta find it back. All right, so appreciating the framing about having both the narrative shifts and the material gains. And also know that you've spoken is only a piece of the work. Can you speak more to centering queer and trans people and how that informs this work?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I think, yeah, even as I was putting this together, that was the other piece that I felt like, oh, I don't really have time for everything. I think for us, actually, what's so interesting about that is how organic it was in a lot of ways. Like we were just seeing year after year that the people who were showing up, who were like ready to organize, right, who were ready to stand in solidarity with the people most impacted by whatever it was, were like queer and trans Asian folks within our Asian community, and for queer and trans Asian young people particularly. And so for us, we started being like, well, okay, if that's true, like then, you know, we should actually like figure out what that means and how we center, right? Because right, there's something here, and I think that it does, you know, on a broad level. To me, it's like, oh, it comes from this idea of like who feels at the margins, who has felt like just challenged to be part of their ethnic communities or our broader Asian community, and who's ready to build something different. And I think that a queer and trans framework for us, even beyond our folks who identify as queer and trans, really is around this idea of like, we can build something different and we don't have to be stuck in these boxes that exist. And we can imagine a different kind of world and a different way we relate to each other. So I think that's a way we try to like bring in a queer and trans organizing framework, even with parts of our organizing that are less specifically like queer and trans people, but that we also like just know that queer and trans folks do so much of this work, and we wanted to make that visible. And we felt like it has been an important intervention in conversations around Asian communities.
Yeah, and another question coming in from a person who teaches Asian American Lit here at BU is any suggestions on how to undo or unlearn biases that Asian American students have come to internalize? For example, students who express that they feel paralyzed by their own self-loathing or doubt, or have resisted asking for help and support when needed, and I think often informed by the model minority myth.
Yeah, I think I would just say, to repeat myself from earlier, I think it's right, it's a challenge, it's a process. I think it is one of the things that's like challenging about organizing Asian American folks is some of this, like just what people have internalized about whether it's like the model minority myth internalized or the self-loathing, kind of these different things. But I think, I think we just have to, I think organizing can be a mental health intervention in that way. And I think that people finding their voice is, and in a collective way, not just an individual way, is so powerful to shifting those narratives. But, you know, it's not easier said than done a lot of times, but I do really believe that.
Kind of like creating that grace and that moment of like, hey, this does happen, and here are things that you can do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that it's not that your individual journey is so important, but that the more people feel part of a collective, I think the more that that they can take those risks, right? Because it's different. So the more we can create like real supportive community with each other, to take those risks, to move beyond the doubt, I think that is how then we build that muscle to be able to do that over and over.
Yeah, so that they don't feel alone in doing this and they have that solidarity. Another question here is, one of the problems in pushing political agenda for Asian Americans is really the division that I think you talked about within the Asian American umbrella. For example, here in Massachusetts, they failed to pass the data disaggregation bill. What could be done to build solidarity within the group and really pushing a policy agenda, considering the diversity within this AAPI language that people like to use?
Yeah, thank you for that. And never fear, we do have the data equity bill has been reintroduced, so we will get it this time. But so just to put in a plug for that, because we do feel like, I mean, a little less facetiously, we feel like, you know, when we talk about anti-Asian violence, when we talk about invisibility, the data, having good data about our different ethnic communities is a key part to fighting this invisibility. So it is a critical time. I would just say to your broader question, I really appreciate it. I think that is, to me, it's one of the big questions that many of us in Asian American coalitions are, Asian American and AAPI coalitions are asking. And I think that, well, one, I think we're always going to have right-wing factions within any community, right? So I know that there was a talk earlier in the series about kind of when nationalism and right-wing organizing, but, you know, even within our communities, there's always going to be right-wing factions. And so, so that is just a reality, right? But then beyond that, how do we build like a popular narrative, platform that is broad and that addresses these root issues, right? So, you know, maybe people have heard something about data disaggregation on a WeChat group or on a Kakao Talk group that they don't like, right? But when we talk to folks about like what's going on in your town, in your neighborhood, is the housing affordable? Is the school system working for your children? Is, you know, are folks able to access good jobs? Like probably they have, you know, can you find adequate mental health resources for your, you know, Asian language speaking parent? Like the answer, we know the answers to those questions, right? And so I think that there is a real opportunity for us to continue to build a platform, to build a multi-issue agenda that highlights those things so that folks can see their own experiences seen in. And I think then we make the case that things like data equity are ways we can get some of these things done. But I think that contending with the right wing elements, even within our own communities, is a critical piece of work that we can't ignore.
Really acknowledging that and not trying to be like, oh, it doesn't exist here, but being like, it does exist. And here's what we're going to do about it. Love that, Carolyn. And I think what your presentation and a lot of the questions drive home for me is that we're talking about it. We're talking about it. We're thinking about it. And there are people taking action on it right now. So I hope that gives me hope. And I love that this bill is reintroduced. Let us know how we can get involved. But yeah, what a wonderful presentation and questions. I think I have a little bit of time. I'll ask if there's any other questions, or Carolyn, if you have any final thoughts and reflections for us.
Sorry, I was putting the info, but yeah, maybe we can give it a second for other questions, but I can buy us a minute and say, yeah, no, I just really appreciate folks' questions and being here tonight. And I think that I think to me, you know, ultimately, right, like it can all feel so complicated, but it really is like, how do we build containers that where folks feel that sense of collectiveness, like collective action, collective experience, collective like witness, and how do we build those containers, right? Whether it's for us within Asian communities or in other communities, because that's gonna, you know, just coming together and doing the work together is how we get more clarity on what needs to come next and how we build together to build towards something different. And so I feel like, you know, there's so much nuance and there's so much difference and there's so much to work through, but I trust that every time folks are in a room together, we're able to figure out the next right step to move towards a different world.
Thank you. And that kind of reminds me of our first speaker who spoke of hope is recognizing that adversity exists, but that a different future is possible and we must get there. So Carolyn, thank you so much. Dawn has just put in the CEU link. So if you're here in Massachusetts and want some CEUs, go ahead and fill out that form. We just want to thank everybody for coming. And Carolyn, thank you so much for your talk. Obviously, we all resonated and generated a lot of thoughts. And to our really insightful reflectors, Hayu Chris Ham, Desi Hartman, and Sami John. And also to the amazing behind the scenes tech person, Greer Hamilton. Please go ahead and fill out this form. And in the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon and not a sprint. Please take good care of yourselves in this fight and in this journey. It has definitely been a wild 2 years because we definitely need all of you if we're going to create a better world. We hope to see you soon at our January E&I Speaker Series event on Thursday, January 22nd, when Jennifer Gomez will present on cultural betrayal and conundrums, the making of a book. Thank you all. Thank you again to this amazing crew, and onward. Thanks, Carolyn. And go ahead and click on that CEU form if you need it.